This next opening is called the King's Gambit, and it was very popular in the 1800s and before that, where players were very swashbuckling and they went on the attack at all costs. But since then, black has learned to defend more properly, and it's not seen as often now, but it is still played, and there are games that have been played in 2015. I'll show you one in a bit. But first, let's look at why it lost popularity. So the game begins with pawn to e4, and black responds with pawn to e5, and now white immediately attacks that center pawn with pawn to f4. Well, this opens up this diagonal to the king. So when someone offers you a pawn, this gambit, you don't have to accept it. You can. In the next game, we'll see one where he does. And look at the ideas behind this king's gambit. And maybe white taking might not be the best. But all these variations can be played, but they all have strengths and weaknesses. So in this variation, black does not take the pawn and develops his bishop. And now, if white foolishly captures the pawn, well, why don't you pause the video right now and see what can happen to white. So pause the video. Okay, did you notice that this diagonal is open and the queen is free to check the king? All right, so the queen checks, and now white blocks this check. Pause the video again and see what you can do. Pause the video. Okay, notice that there's another check. The checks continue, and with it the loss of material for white. So the queen can slide over here with check, and whatever white does, he can block with the queen, with the bishop, with the knight. The queen is free to capture this rook, and he's up a whole piece, and with proper play he'll go on to win the game. Okay, so now let's look at another game where white does not capture that pawn and see how the king's gambit can actually work. So the game starts with pawn to e4, pawn to e5, establishing a center. And now we go into the king's gambit. And this time around, black takes the pawn. And white develops his bishop. Because black is saying, hey, you're giving me a pawn, I'm going to take it. If I can hold on to it, I'll be up a pawn in the end game. And then that extra pawn can become a queen. So that's the general idea at accepting a gambit pawn. But you give up something. You can never get anything for free. So black throws this check in, and the king runs. Because you see, if he tries to block, he can't really block now because this pawn is doing its job. If he pushes, the pawn can take, and the pawn can't take because the rook is undefended here, and the queen would be free to capture the rook. So the king runs, and the pawn moves to open up this bishop. The knight develops, defending his pawn. The bishop wants to see the basic strategy now for black. When you're up material, you want to try and trade down. You want to try and trade all the pieces off, and then going into the endgame, you'll have the extra pawn that might be able to become a queen. So anyway, white backs off, and the knight develops here. And now here's what white gets out of this gambit. Now he's established a very strong center with pawns here. So his pieces can get more mobility. He'll hope to cramp black's pieces and then try and find an attack because of it. So now he slides the pawn up here, defending this pawn. White attacks the queen with the development. The queen backs off, eyeing the queen. Black wants to trade off queens. He wants to try and trade off all the pieces judiciously, safely. And now white hits this pawn. If he takes, then the rook can capture, and then this pawn will drop. So he doesn't do that. He defends this pawn, and the king runs, defending the rook because he isn't able to take this because the rook was undefended. But now that is the threat. The threat is to take this pawn. and the queen would be, the rook would be attacking the queen. So the pawn advances, attacking the knight, but he also weakens this pawn now. So the knight backs off, bishop captures, opens up this file for the rook, doubles up, there's always a gain and a loss, so he does double white's pawns, but he gives white this open file. The knight develops, attacking this pawn, but it's defended once. The knight develops, putting two attackers on this pawn. Notice there is no pawn that can defend this pawn, so that pawn's probably going to drop. And now the pawn advances to expose the queen and go for the queen trade. And white moves the queen up to try and force black into capturing this way, and then if he takes with the pawn, he'll be supporting this center pawn. And he does take. Pawn takes. The knight slides back to remaneuver. Probably go after this pawn. And white prepares a defense of this pawn with a pawn. The knight is defending it, but you don't want pieces defending pawns. Ideally, you want pawns defending pawns, so your pieces can be free to go do more dastardly things. So the knight does slide in, attacking the pawn, and now he solidifies his center. So look at white's center here. He's got a very strong center defended by pawns, and black is getting cramped. And this pawn's going to drop, and then this pawn becomes weak. The rook defends. The king slides up, and now he hits the center. The threat is pawn takes, knight takes. So he pushes. That's one way of dealing with an attack, right? You can try to run, you can try to defend, you can try to block, try and knock off the attacker. Those are things that occur, are options that may be available to you in all of your games. So you look for those possible ways of dealing with an attack. And in this case, white pushes. He moves the target. So the knight runs, but see he has three attackers on this pawn. He captures. Knight takes, knight takes. Now this pawn is very weak. Black castles long on the queen side. The knight slides in, eyeing this square here. Your goal is to penetrate enemy territory, and when you go in with pieces, you would ideally like them supported with pawns, and also on squares that can't be harassed by pawns. And you notice here there are no pawns that can push this knight away once it arrives there. So this pawn develops, giving the king a square, allowing the rooks to come over. So the knight takes that square, the rook attacking the rook runs, and now this pawn advances. So, it's piece activity. You're really trying to control your opponent's ability to move his pieces about the board, all things being equal. And this pawn is on a dark square, and this bishop is on a dark square, so this square is not available to the bishop. So this is probably the reason that white pushed this pawn forward, to keep that square unavailable to this bishop. The king slides over, allowing the rook more squares and defending the knight. Now the king takes the pawn. The knight slides in, attacking this undefended pawn. And what does white do? Again, he moves the target. Knight slides in, attacking the rook and the bishop, so he doesn't want to give up the rook, so he moves the rook. And now this pawn advances, trying to break up this pawn chain here, structure. So white captures. I guess there was a threat here with this bishop. Pawn takes, and bishop takes. So he would win a pawn. So he takes instead. Pawn takes. Now the bishop runs. He doesn't give him the opportunity to capture the bishop. King runs over here, gets out of the way for the rook. The king starts a maneuver, probably over to the queen side here. And the pawn advances. I mean, black's hoping to try and get some activity over here. You know, he could push. He's got his bishop on this diagonal. King slides over. Now the knight remaneuvers to get into an attacking posture. Slides over here. You can at least attack the bishop. And he will be attacking this pawn. You know, you always want to try to maximize your pieces, make them do something other than just sitting around. They should be attacking something. So now this pawn is loose, and he goes after it since the knight gave him that square. So that's the other thing you do is whenever your opponent's pieces move, you see what square is available, that has become available to you, and also you should pay attention to that when you move, before you move, to say, what am I giving my opponent? Which squares am I giving my opponent now? So the knight slides over, attacking this pawn. And now here are where the big decisions take place, and this is where experience and skill enter the game. Whole idea of tit for tat, I'll give you this in exchange for that. So white does not defend this pawn. He takes this pawn instead. He wants to get this open file. So he takes that and gives black that pawn. Then he runs up with a check. King attacks the rook. And now the other rook slides over, and the rooks are united. You know, rooks united are often stronger than the queen. So the knight slides over, attacking the bishop. And now the rooks are free to really harass this king. The king slides over, getting closer into the fray here, where the main action is. That's another thing you always have to try to determine. Where's the main action? So the knight slides over, hoping to help the king out a bit, and also defending this pawn, because there was a little threat here actually. If knight takes, rook takes, then the king could take this. So he's threatening to win this pawn. Knight slides over. The bishop slides over here. I'm not sure about the main purpose of that, so I'm not going to analyze it too long. The rook defends this pawn. I mean, maybe he was looking at this and this, I don't know. Knight slides over. Two attackers on this pawn. He wants to remaneuver, maybe get back into here. The bishop becomes active over here, but this is all well defended over here. So white really achieved the cramping of black's pieces and their mobility. Now the knight gets over to the action over here on the queen side, where the king is. And the bishop slides back over here. Black really doesn't know what to do, so he's going to try and defend at all costs if he can. And the check goes in, so the mating threats are going to begin now. The king runs. The rook pins the knight, so he starts compromising his pieces. We looked at the pin in the beginner tactical section. The king gets out of the pin, and the knight captures this pawn. Let's see. Yes, I see now. If the knight takes this knight, then this pawn could check the king, forking the knight and king, and maybe mating the king in the process. Let's see. It would check him. The king would run. It would probably be mate. This other rook checking the king here. You can look at that on your own. So this rook gets into the action, and he throws in the check anyway. The knight takes. The knight slides over with check. The king runs up because he has no other squares. Can't run here, can't run here. The rooks are guarding this file. King runs up, and this rook can check the king here. And that would be checkmate, except there is a block right here. And white can now try and set up a mating net here. He can slide back because this square is guarded by the king here. This square is guarded by the pawn. So this would be, I believe, checkmate, or in two moves. Let's see, check. The king could slide here, and then this rook slides over with checkmate because the knight is guarding this square. So it's game over, and black resigns. So this is an example where things really worked out well in the King's Gambit for white. He was able to achieve the center that he wanted by attacking that center pawn. He was able to establish his own pawns in the center, which cramps the black pieces, and he slowly was able to put more pressure on and eventually win pieces and then go on a mating attack.